Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Been looking forward to this one for a while. I'm joined by Hansel. Hansel is an aspiring physicist, perhaps an aspiring theologian and philosopher as well. I'm not sure if he'd be comfortable with that sort of description, but certainly has an interest in these things. And we're going to be talking about something I think is quite important, the ideas and definitions of right and left in terms of political polarities. Now, I should say at the outset that one thing that might make this conversation a bit more interesting is that whatever similarities there might be between my worldview and Fanzu's, there are also profound differences. For example, he is a devout Catholic, and I am a godless heathen, so to speak. Um, and I also am not interested in anime, and he is for some reason. No offense to people interested in anime. But the fundamental question you want to ask is what is left and what is right? And something that Hansel pointed out to me a while back was that perhaps the left can be seen more as lying on a continuum or a spectrum, whereas the right, or what seems to be described as the right, is sort of all over the place. So I'd hand the podium over to Hansel to maybe expand upon that because I have some of my own ideas, but I'd like first for him to maybe put forward that idea.
Oh, yeah. So essentially, what I kind of thought about was something along the lines of a sort of in-group, out-group sort of definition that the left, with its various sub-ideologies, kind of describes itself as the in-group. And even though you do have, of course, you have significant political differences within the left, they seem to be less significant as the ones you see in the right, which would be more viewed as an outgroup from the perspective of the left. So right wing in that sense would be everything that isn't part of the left and not a part of left wing orthodoxy.
Hmm. That definitely makes sense. Though that, and that's kind of the comment I wanted to make. The issue that arises from that is you end up in this very strange situation, quote unquote, being on the right, whatever that means, where you get radically different philosophies, worldviews, perspectives. Let's contrast something like any kind of, not necessarily Catholic, but any kind of Christian traditionalist worldview, which would be viewed as right wing, with Ayn Randian objectivism. And I'm hesitant to find, or I find it difficult to find any similarity there. I mean, uh, yeah, I can't really. If I mean,
Perhaps a basic kind of interest in Aristotle, but even then,
yeah, it's quite deviant in the understanding of Aristotle. Yeah, that might be something, but apart from that, I mean, uh, they couldn't be further apart, and yet they're both right wing. And those people, if you were to put them in the same room, probably wouldn't get along very well. And then you have things like, classical liberalism or libertarianism, which, in terms of just sort of contrasting it with more sort of traditional Christian values, is a lot more well, liberal essentially. The allowance of thing and the allowance of things or what have you. But that
right.
too is viewed as right, and you get all this sort of strain. And I think we come to the sort of current year where we're at right now, sort of middle of 2020, where oddly enough, in light of the destruction, the riots, and I guess ongoing chaos in the United States, I'm not sure. I've kind of lost track. Where if you think that statues or basically works of art shouldn't be torn down, or more importantly, that communities, both figuratively and literally, shouldn't be set aflame and burned to the ground in a very pragmatic sense, because your local grocery store isn't there anymore, and that's not a good thing, pragmatically speaking, but also just in terms of overall sort of cultural damage, that's viewed as right wing too. It seems at least, because even as if the people on the left I've encountered don't give it a green light entirely, they will create an excuse for it, whereas I can't think of it. I find it rather inexcusable, and that would make me right wing by that view alone. And so we find ourselves, I think, in the current year in a very bizarre situation where people who really have very little in common in terms of their um, intellectual content and how they view the world have been thrown in a pot, and it just doesn't work. It's like trying to create a beef stew, but putting bananas in it and cherries and just things that don't make any sense for that
Yes,
context. Yeah.
um, exactly. It doesn't seem to work. That is actually a kind of I think one of the bigger political problems we have with quote unquote fighting the left right now. Not fighting as in, active
Yeah.
physical violence, but as like kind of standing in opposition to the left wing. Because again, there are varying ideologies within the left, but they kind of all seem to pull at the same string. And even though you could define being a right wing again as like an opposition towards certain left wing views that are just wrong, or it seemed to be wrong when you come from more like right wing perspective. Um, you end up with this sort of strange situation where even though all of the people within the right might disagree with what the left is doing and might stand in opposition to that, standing, I don't think that standing in the opposition of something seems to be more like a defensive line of acting, which long term doesn't seem to be very successful, and therefore, due to the lack of like a uniting positive vision of the world, as in, okay, we want to achieve this and that. Um, it seems to it seems to be that like this sort of defensive line is the only line the right can really take, and therefore is kind of almost destined to lose in
Yeah,
this.
I know exactly what you mean because it's sort of the right as a group of many different ingredients in this bizarre stew, which doesn't really make much sense. It's being defined by what it isn't as opposed to by what it is, a sort of non-identity. So, what is the right? Well, maybe it's not burning things down, not destroying art, not claiming that all human beings are equal, whatever that is. I mean, it's a negative. It's being defined by a negative, and I think that creates problems if one or groups of people wanted to organize, because the question is, you can I mean, I don't really think I'm on the right, but by the lights of today's definition, I suppose I am. Um, we people who ostensibly, you're definitely on the right, I guess, but people who are ostensibly on the right, where do we where do we ally ourselves in terms of values and what we think is worth pursuing when we're defined by a negative, the privation of something, in a sense. Um, because whereas the left, it to me, and this is only my interpretation, it is on this sort of continuum. I've viewed the left as always sort of pushing for change. That's sort of the fundamental sort of dissatisfaction with reality itself, which I think is not entirely a bad thing. And sometimes you want improvements. You want to, it's good to improve certain things sometimes. But the fundamental disagreement, it seems to be, so on the left, if you look at characters, say in the intellectual dark web, who are more sort of left of center and not, outwardly or obviously progressive in the current year, the definition of the term.
You may have two exceptions, but they're more honorary members, so I would actually agree.
Yeah, that it's just not, it's going too fast. That's the issue. It's not that this is bad stuff, and of course you want quote unquote equality. Of course you want everything a level playing ground. You want people not feel or be disadvantaged, but maybe dismantling the police is a little bit too much, or maybe that this needs to be gradual. And so that the it seems to me at least the core disagreement amongst people uh, on or within left-wing ideology is the question of how fast this is supposed to take place, how rapid this is going, and yeah, it's obviously some of them. I mean, the Weinstein brothers are a good example of people who are technically far left by old school definitions, who just find it a bit too much. It's going, or as in too, it's just too quick for them. And then other people like Sam Harris, I'm obviously talking about the so-called IDW, although there's not much intellectual or dark about it, web, uh, more left of center, and for him it's definitely just too much. And yeah, and a host of other people who just think, you know, maybe you don't quite need to burn things down or burn the police station down, and then whatever the ultimate truth behind
I
COVID
mean,
might
it's
be.
telling that
Hmm.
with the intellectual dark web, it's telling that Ben Shapiro is considered the black sheep of the IDW.
Yeah, and Ben Shapiro is. I mean, I guess yeah, I guess he is right wing, sort of. Yeah, he's right wing. He's definitely not left wing. But I don't know what his credentials are.
He's a conservative, but he's very much libertarian within his conservatism.
Yeah, although I would say that with reservation. I would say yes, he is, but I think he has sort of Israel first policy, and within the context of his religious tradition, obviously there's certain things that are not permissible, but in the context of the United States, yeah, I mean, he has, famously his line, well, guys, I don't know what the problem is. GDP is up 7.5%, and I know it looks problematic here, well, lots of problems, but, GDP is up. There are plenty of jobs. People just don't want to go there. They just don't want to do it. It's all about GDP, and then, so he's a bit of a dichotomy, on the one hand, he supports, I don't want to spend too much time, Ben Shapiro, talking about sort of free market capitalism, but obviously thinks it's very important to support the state of Israel and also support his own religious tradition and practice exclusion at the same time, although he doesn't think that's important in the United States. But that's neither here nor there yet. He is included in that. I don't know why. The term itself, intellectual dark web, was created by a another. Well, actually, she's a left-wing Zionist, a Zionist woman named Bari Weiss, who just it, it's not as if it took a lot of mental endurance and fortitude. She just threw in an article one day and used it to describe people who were somewhat critical of the extreme forms of progressivism. But yeah, again, I don't really think the term is descriptive of very much. It just because as we're seeing now, if you don't think vandalism is a good thing, that's a sort of rebellious position, right? In a way, or at least if you don't greenlight vandalism, that's seen as a sort of an edgy position, because you're not saying, well, you're not either creating excuses and saying, well, it's okay, I understand you're angry and you're upset, so it's okay to smash in the windows and destroy the property, or what have you. It's it's kind of just weak sauce, the IDW. That would be sort of my very brief, well, it wasn't too brief, summary of that. But for them, yeah, the left, it's a question of this is all good in theory. It's just how it's happening too rapidly. And for the right, I mean, again, I'm reluctant to call myself on the right. There are too many things that I just would take issue with. But apparently, I would be described as that. I know people do describe me that way. So, although alternatively, back in the day, I was characterized as a Marxist, and I've never had held any of those views. But anyway, that's a kind of a weird thing.
Well, you seem to be fundamentally non-egalitarian, so I guess by
Yeah,
now you would be kind of on the right
yeah,
just by proxy.
but Hanzo, the question that's an interesting one. Non-egalitarian. Well, the acknowledgement that people are different, no one is born the same. Some people are born with more advantages than others and more disadvantages. I mean, no tree looks the same. Some trees are tall. I mean, it's just that we live in a world of difference. Sometimes these differences are quite fundamental. Sometimes they're trivial, and usually they're somewhere in between. And yet, I
Sure,
don't.
but
I
you do know
yeah.
the line, all pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than others.
Well, yeah,
Right?
that's the Orwell thing. But I well, don't get well. We can get started on. I hate the word equal. I think it was baked into the word itself. That in the sense and people's understanding and apprehension of the word to be just toxic. And I don't mean the sort of left wing and all, but there's no way you can interpret this um, long term without getting the sense that it must mean that outcomes need to be equal, or it must mean that there's some abstraction that you can strive for called equality or even equity. I think these are just poisonous terms that are very, very ripe for misinterpretation and very dangerous and will and have been misinterpreted. Um, so I don't know what necessarily what words I would use to substitute for them. Maybe you don't need to, because again, in a world of highly differentiated objects and organisms, humans being part of that, I don't know I mean, what world or dimension I would live in where I wouldn't be a non-egalitarian because it's just so obvious that things are and people are not equal. Um, I mean, you know, I'm barely over 174 centimeters. You're something like what, 190 something, right?
188.
Yeah, there you go. So, you know, you're over 10 significantly over 10. That, you know, that's, I mean, it's a minor point, arguably, but that's a difference. There are differences everywhere. So how could anyone who's intellectually honest, maintain an egalitarian view? Now, I know some people, well, it's equal before the law, but you know, I like to go in the details. I don't even think that's plausible because of some of the cognitive biases that are baked into our own minds. So this whole terminology, equal, equitable, it's horrible. I wish we would just jettison it, get rid of it, throw it in the trash.
So,
Yeah.
if I'd be trying to steelman left-leaning positions as far as I understand them, the idea is less that all men are intrinsically equal, but that some differences are unjust insofar as they are not stemming from man's intrinsic nature, but rather are um, consequence of various societal elements. So, as an example, wealth inequality. Now, you could make a perfectly reasonable argument for why wealth inequality might be dependent on the abilities of various different people, and that seems pretty straightforward. On the other hand, some left wingers would make the argument that our economic system is fundamentally unjust and therefore will create unjust inequality, which I think is somewhat wrong, but and
Yeah.
in honesty, I don't even see like the moral value of equality. Um,
Yeah, you're taking obviously a Christian perspective. I just don't. I just see it as a non-starter. I mean, why? It's I don't know. It's like calling a snake an elephant. They're just not. A snake isn't an elephant. It's just sort of an obvious thing. Now, to your point, your Steelman point, as you attempt to play a character on the left, I suppose.
yeah,
Well,
it's more of like a devil's advocate.
yeah, yeah, no, yes, I get it. Devil's advocate, Steelman. It's good to Steelman. Yeah, I sure. But what the left then loses vision of is all these sort of incremental improvements that, as they've accrued now, have resulted in a standard of living and all these things that are just far better than what people historically have ever had. I mean, it's not wrong to say that whatever problems exist now, and there are always problems, and also in terms of real serious problems, we're better off now than we ever have been. And it's not perfect, but here's the related to this is this idea. So the left tends to reject sort of um, intrinsic nature or things being sort of wedded to, I suppose, you as a Catholic on forms or whatever. So I would say, things that are just intrinsic to people because of a combination of genes and environment. Now, the weird thing to me is that there's a sort of tacit assumption made by the left that if everything is malleable in the world at large or in the environment, um, then you can change everything. But only if we were omnipotent and perhaps as well omniscient, which we're not, would we have that level of control over the environment. Which is to say, is that I don't think you can. we have the power or the knowledge to change the world such that you would get these more favorable outcomes that they speak of, even if it were entirely just based on uh, a poorly organized environmental principle, you know. So I, I maybe I'm just too much of a cynic, but I think sometimes incremental change and things being good enough is the best we can do. And yeah, because again, getting back to the earlier point, let's assume we implemented the things the left want and it still wasn't good enough. Again, there's no end to it. There's always going to be something that they can complain about. I said this in a video a while back. If everyone were living in a mansion, five bedrooms and swimming pool, everything, but then wealthy people were living in places like, I don't know, Neuschwanstein Schloss or something like that, right?
Right.
Then they would complain that why do they get to live in castles? I live in this shitty mansion. It's we have a pool and we have four bathrooms. It's not enough. It's not fair. There's no way to ever really get there, which is I think what I really would retort with. At what point in time is it sufficient? And some of them have acknowledged, at least to me, that it's never sufficient. It's never good enough. So.
Right. Perhaps they kind of view it as okay, even if we will never eradicate all inequality, we should still always push forward and try to do it as much as possible. But then again, like there's kind of my basic question, which is, all right, why is it even a moral good? Should we even attempt to do this? And then, of course, and I guess it would be more like your complaint. How is this even feasible? How do we know that this
Mm.
won't go wrong? Is this even practical?
Yeah, I mean, you're adding an interesting, maybe even an important element. Why is equality a good thing? I don't really ask that question for myself because it's such a non-starter as a concept that I mean, I don't know, it'd be like why is being a flying elephant a good thing? It doesn't exist. It's sort of what's the point? But sure, I mean, that is if you are going to engage with the left, I imagine it is important to ask these questions. They take it as a sort of axiomatic good, I guess. Even though again, it's a non-starter in my view. I'd assume at least that view we do share that it's a non-starter. Um,
Sure,
yeah,
sure.
why is it good? I'm not really sure. It's not really something I've ever thought about because I just think it's not part of reality. So, what would be your sort of opposite if you were to sort of question or engage with someone on that point? What would be the line of questioning? I mean, how would you go about that?
Um, I guess I would just start with that single question. Why is this a good thing? Why is this to be desired over other goods?
Mm,
Because honestly, I don't see why this should be the starting point for like morality, or especially like our political goals. I
yeah.
don't like that. That's also something I find to be somewhat strange. And okay, perhaps this is just like a bit of a remaining. Even though I'm not a liberal, perhaps this is just a bit of a remaining lip between the private person and the public person. But even if I was to accept that equality is a good thing and that we would strive towards greater equality, I do not see in how far this is by necessity a thing that should be this sought in the public space. Like by the means of politics. Now you could say that, and I guess many leftists would make the argument that this is due to the fact that what keeps us from reaching a certain level of equality, should we ever be able to, are social structures.
Mm,
But uh, then again, there is this second question, which is it even feasible to eliminate these structures by the means of politics? And wouldn't that lead to perhaps lead to greater injustices.
Yeah, it's a good point you make. I think the starting point for them, and I don't think they're going to acknowledge this, is that I think something foundational to this obsession with equality is the emotion of resentment, or envy in some cases, as Shakespeare called it, the green monster envy. That person X or group X has something that we want, and it's pointed out that they have this, and there are all sorts of complexities that have gone into that, historical, situational, etc. And somehow this other person or group didn't have that, and so this needs to be relentlessly pointed out. It's really that's what grievance politics is. Equality, the desire for equality, is based on grievance, resentment, envy, um, and as a consequence, I think ultimately malice. The Where you no longer wish well upon your fellow man because he just has something that you don't have. And I think we all have experience with this. I remember when I was much younger, say your age, I would find myself, maybe not frequently, but sometimes in bouts of envy. Um, I remember a guy I went to university with, a French guy, Jules. He was very tall and handsome, and sort of as you would joke, the guy who would have to, fend the women off with sticks. They would sort of chase after him. Of course, there was a different mentality back then, and I just realized just I mean, it was not the first realization I'd witnessed before, but just sort of a person living effectively on the same plane of existence, but also in a very different stratum. And I felt envy, and then sometimes, every now and then, almost a lack of well wishing. Not it almost never really got extreme, but now this is me in my early 20s. Point is, that sort of thing can amplify itself. It can become organized. It can, which is, I think, goes hand in hand with this idea of always wanting to change things. There's always something that somebody's going to have that you don't have, whatever it might be. It might be physical, it might be spiritual, it might be mental, who knows, it might be a combination of all of the above. And this will push people then to want to seize it for themselves. And they can use terminology then like equality or egalitarianism or equity to justify things because it sounds good on the surface. Whereas, to your point, they've never even posed the questions to why that's a good thing. And I think the reason why they don't is because, well, frankly, they're motivated by resentment, envy, and grievance. And so it's they're not going through a sort of logical reasoning process. Far from it. It's it emerges from the bowels of their emotions. And things that emerge emotionally are typically don't really need much justification, certainly not in the eyes of the people proposing those things, you know.
Right. Of course, you could kind of always ask the question in what sense politics or like our basic sets of moral axioms are motivated by reason. I guess I would be kind of on the one side of the spectrum where we can definitely have like a reasonable foundation for our morals, while you would be more on the this is dependent on human psychology kind of end
I
of the spectrum. Right.
well,
I would assume.
I, I mean, depends. Obviously, reasonable itself is something you could quibble over and discuss, but I think that there are certain human limitations for sure, psychological limitations. Um, yeah, and obviously emotion will our politics, not yours or mine, but just in general, people, human beings, we're all in part motivated by natural inclinations that we've been endowed with
Sure, I'm not
through
denying that.
nature. It's just that, yeah, to establish your system, you need first principles. And since when has a discussion of first principles been even a thing in recent years in the political scene? I mean, neither in Germany nor in the United States. Could you imagine macros going up? Well, okay, we need to talk about first principles here. This,
This is
yeah,
the pretty interesting because yeah, I think that's honestly one of the bigger issues when it comes to the current political divide we're facing, which and this might just be my perception right now. It seems to be greater than it has ever been before in recent memory, where
yes, yeah,
where the lines have really hardened, and I think part of this goes back to uh, our principles or even first principles to the point where we don't have like the same basic assumptions about the world.
no, we don't. There's much
Right.
more variability in our basic assumptions about the world. Um, I think part of that, if you want to go, even further back, I mean, I'm sort of exclusively talking about Europe here because I feel that's what I'm most qualified to talk about. But um, because education has become so widely accessible, which people on the left would argue is a good thing, and I'm not entirely sure about that, and we could have that's a separate discussion, which may or may not be part of this discussion. But um, basic assumptions about the world came from figures of authority. I mean, obviously in the Catholic tradition, the worldview was dictated by the church, and the recipients were people who were neither educated nor lettered nor perhaps in some cases even capable of understanding, at least in great detail. Um, but with the coming of mass education and mass literacy, and one could debate whether that's a good or bad thing, you end up with a situation where an authoritarian system and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but let's be honest, a hierarchical authoritarian system of the sort that the Catholic Church used to be, and in as much as it was a political entity, no longer is functional. So I don't think you can have a discussion about first principles when, in as much as there are even first principles, there are probably dozens and dozens of suggestions because regarding them because everyone is starting from a different position. And this seems to be, I probably would agree, maybe one of the greatest issues of our age, because we're all coming from a different starting position. There's a general rejection of authority, which is sometimes is understandable, especially with current governments. But also, my view is that education is, hmm, well, actually, I don't want to, just allow me a minute or two extra. This is kind of interesting, because now we're sort of because I do think it's key education. When you compare and contrast the German educational system with the American one, it's very telling because, as you probably know, close to 60% of Germans pursue trades. Most Germans never finish gymnasium, and for the Americans, that's sort of like, I guess you could call it like an advanced high school, which then permits you to proceed forward to university. In the United States, education is seen as this universal. Everyone needs to go to college. I mean, people who in a German system would never, just because they lack the intellectual wherewithal, they don't have the Geisteskraft, as it were. And there's nothing wrong with being a bricklayer. But that's a part of our earlier just point, right? But they're but in the States it's different. Everyone needs to be educated. Everyone, and so it's no surprise to me, both partly because of other things, but also because of this, that so much of uh, the insanity we see emanating in the world comes from the United States. It's one of these countries with and I it's not an idea of sort of universal education. Uh,
Right. This might kind of be somewhat linked to like the founding of the United States. Well, let's be honest. Germany is a European country, so it's probably still a bit more ingrained in like various lines of thoughts that came out of Europe. And like, isn't the German education system partially modeled after the Prussian education system?
yes,
So,
yes, yeah,
and that like Prussian sensibilities were obviously different from American sensibilities, which are much more based on like kind of early Enlightenment ideas.
yeah, definitely. And there's no doubt an aspect of that there, but
Which might
it,
also explain why we, when it comes to even though like some of the philosophers that left love citing are Europeans, continentals, it doesn't seem surprising that like these waves of activism seem to mostly come out of the USA, right?
Yeah, I think it's a big part of it. Education for all, and then of course what goes along with that is this idea that everyone is quote unquote equal. So that's the sort of emotional justification why education should be available to all people. Of course, it's a Ponzi scheme in the States because it's available to you if you indebt yourself to the point where you can never pay it back in many cases. Um, Whereas this is just not a thought for your average Joe in Germany. I mean, the vast majority of people will complete Realschule, which is a kind of in between. I don't know how, there's no good sort of way of transferring that into a sort of American description, but so some kind of high school, and then just I don't know, and if they're female, maybe become a hairdresser or a carpenter as a male or whatever, and they're not going to think twice about it. They don't think it's a bad thing or good. They just kind of do it. What's interesting, I do think, is that Europe does receive these waves or these sort of microwave radiation, so to speak, from the United States, uh, and it's not immune to it completely because even in Germany, you can't really have a discussion about first principles. To your point, I used to when I used to work at in a warehouse and also with quote unquote normies, they would the first thing they did would be to leave the church so they didn't have to tithe anymore. Kirchensteuer. Uh, you know, it's not. I mean, Germany has differences, and yet it's a profoundly, largely, I think, still secular place. I mean, most people don't spend much time in the church. I wonder. I'm not even. I mean, I have to be intellectually honest. It's difficult to assert first principles without invoking some sort of religious suppositions about the world or something like that. Which is probably another reason why you just don't have discussions about first principles. It needs to start somewhere, and you need to assume something. And Christian tradition would just be the starting point is God, and then once you have that established and make that assumption, then everything can kind of
Right.
flow from that.
That might be another big difference between that and then and now. Like even let's say after the Protestant Reformation or the Enlightenment, large percentages of the population, including some of the relevant thinkers of these movements, were still, in some sense, Christians, right? So there was still, even though there were significant differences, which became bigger and bigger with as time went by, they had a basic belief system that they all shared, and so they could kind of refer back to the same ideas roughly. While
Yes.
today, like an age of increasing secularism, it's not really clear. I wouldn't say that it's impossible to find, a shared sort of worldview in this sort of age. But I think it's or even find out about first principles in the sort of age via philosophical means. But it's much harder to find a worldview that a large percentage of the public will share.
Yeah. I mean, the departure, obviously, you know, I don't want to turn this into a theological discussion, but we'll just sort of the figurative expression, God is dead, a la Nietzsche. That's been the case for well over a century, arguably longer. And that view definitely has led to all sorts of things. I mean, I'm not hostile to the idea that some of the many the worst and many atrocities that took place during the 20th century, I'm not entirely sure that would have happened had the sort of dead God is dead worldview taken hold. It's possible, but so yeah, I think there's actually a it's interesting that there's a French philosopher. I believe her name is Chantal Desiree, maybe. Anyway, she wrote a book called Icarus Fallen. I believe she wrote it in the no, she wrote that book in the 90s, right? But she might be deceased. I don't know. The point that she makes is to sort of summarize the book. I would recommend reading it as opposed to just taking my summary. But um, we in the West are suffering, in a sense, in a way, that Icarus might have had he flown to the heights of the heavens. His wings get singed and he falls down. They're no longer functional, and he gets up anyway. It doesn't. In the myth, of course, he pays the ultimate price for his hubris, and he dies. He falls to his death. But in Icarus Fallen, uh, the French philosopher presenting this idea, um, for some reason, Icarus he rises again. He falls to the ground from the heavens, but he gets back up. And the analogy she makes is everything has been tried, right? Christianity, various strains of it, um, various religious schools of thought, um, secular ideologies, political ideologies, all of this stuff. And there's a kind of weariness that is set in. And now collectively in the West, are just sort of, we try to soar to the heavens. It didn't work, but for whatever reason, we're still alive. And we have to ask ourselves the question of what do we do with that? Especially when, I'm not going to make this a sort of a priori assumption, but at least in theory, previous worldviews and ideologies did not really work, ultimately, at least the way she's presenting it. So we're just, which is where it gets to the point of the crisis of meaning, right? That's the sort of the big question, right? I think many things, maybe even everything, is sort of downwards or downstream from this crisis of meaning. Um, even the manosphere stuff, like MGTOW, what does it mean to be a man? What is the situation? Well, had
Right.
traditional roles not been essentially annihilated by not just feminism, but modern technology and things like that, and governance, political systems, maybe a lot of these questions wouldn't need to be asked. And that's just one example. There's so many things that are downstream from this, but to run with the analogy, I mean, if we are in fact Icarus fallen, but through some miracle we're still alive, what do we do? And I think that question is not asked openly, along with the question of first principles.
In fact, I would say it's funny that what you mostly mentioned are kind of religious ideologies, because it seems as though those haven't really gone away in a sense. If you kind of look at the political divide and the varying different political groups, we kind of talked about how they do have like these fundamental moral values that they mightn't even be able to explain it themselves why they pursue certain things like equality, but um, they kind of treat it in this like almost sacred sort of way, right? So in a sense, like politics kind of have become our religion in a sense.
Yes, I think Dave the distributor has pointed this out rightly, that
In,
certainly,
f- in
uh,
fact, just look at how many times fringe political groups kind of accuse them each other of being cults.
yeah, and recently, sort of the washing of the feet of the BLM leaders in the United States, and um, yeah, I mean, this sort of goes to this idea of this instinct that Homo religiosus, that we as in people in general are fundamentally religious creatures, and when you don't have traditional religion, they will turn to something else. I think 20th century ideologies, fascism and stuff, were at some level religious as well. Certainly National Socialism, and with its sort of reverence for some things partly true, some things largely false of the past and what have you, had religious connotations to it. Then that's, I think, something that people don't want to acknowledge. It, I think the issue is, especially among secular people, the unwillingness to acknowledge that maybe most human beings need some sort of religious structure to function reasonably well. Um, Sam Harris is a great example of this, who just it does, you just don't need to put anything in place. You just need to, meditate and you'll be okay. But
Yes, Sam Harris is certainly a weird one because, to be fair, he kind of does seem to care about like this fundamental question of morality. Like he wrote his book, The Moral Landscape,
you know,
which honestly isn't great, but
well, no, I mean, wasn't my my favorite book of his, but either. But yeah, no, he does. Because I think he acknowledges in part that some religious concerns are valid, and he doesn't, in a way that secular people don't, and other secular people don't. They're sort of, well, we don't need to think about it anymore. We're just sort of moving on. Um, I think that that's a big issue. The inability to address the larger issue of lack of meaning and meaninglessness that goes hand in hand with first principles. Um, Sort of what is, here's the other thing, the question of what is the good life? What is a good life? Really basic philosophical question. Well, it's
right.
true that people are very variable, and there's no reality that we inhabit where I would be an aspiring physicist because I'm just too dumb for it. But in general, people say, well, whatever works for you, or okay, and to some extent that's always true. People have different talents and what have you. But what is a good life in a very broad sense?
This is
Nothing
interesting
descriptive about that.
because yes, this does kind of relate to the meaning crisis and to politics in a way. Because if you kind of look at how previous generations political thinkers um, have kind of conceived of politics, they thought a lot about human nature in relation to politics. Like this kind of starts with thinkers like Aristotle, who saw like, man as a social animal who's on the one hand kind of necessitates other human beings in order just to have like a basic division of labor. On the other hand, it would be good for man to interact in the political scene because it's good for him to direct his intentions towards his social ends, like in an inherent virtuous sort of way. And on the other hand, you have thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who like characterized human life in a certain way. I think the quote was nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, and there are good reasons why he did that, English Civil War and what have you.
Right.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. But yeah, the point is from that he kind of derived. Okay, this is what the state should. This is what the state should look like. This is the function of the state. Like same with someone like Aristotle.
Yeah.
Well, nowadays, um, we don't really have like the same perspective. Okay, what is the end of man? What is good for man?
Well, to your point, we don't even talk about human nature, really. Human nature is either a blank slate or something infinitely malleable. Either interpretation gives way to nothing. If man is a blank slate, then you wouldn't design a political system around that necessarily because there's no basis for it. It's just, there's just sort of emptiness, and you just fill the void with, I don't know, Lego or something, Lego blocks. And if man is infinitely malleable, then it's the same basically effectively a version of blank slate theory. That's what you get to. It's just there's nothing, there's no starting point. Um, an acknowledgement of human nature would force people to publicly recognize and grant certain human constants, which are, are as valid today as they were in, um, the 17th century when Hobbes wrote Leviathan, and well over 2 millennia ago when Aristotle was active. I don't really think you can bypass that. But again, to acknowledge human nature is to acknowledge limitations as well. And then we get back to the original point that, right, if you start observing human nature, you'll notice that human beings are not equal. So that's the problem. It's kind of circular in a way, but they all revolve around the same issue that there's a core, there's a sort of constant that
Right.
if you
Then
focus on it, yeah. Mm.
it's interesting because if we kind of go with your analysis right now, then like the left right left divide is even deeper in a sense where it's not just like a disagreement in like first principles. It's like on like an even more meta sort of level where well we don't even agree how to kind of derive the meaning or like what politics should be about. Like
Yeah.
yeah, when on the one hand you kind of derive politics from like this is the nature of man, and on the other hand you don't really seem to think that there's a nature of man, and there's like fundamental divide, and this gap doesn't seem to be able to be closed.
No. And I would argue that when you have a politics that's fundamentally unwedded to something foundational, such as there is a human nature and there's certain things we can observe that are fairly constant throughout history, uh, you end up in the situation we have now where sort of anything goes, and it creates just endless chaos. The only thing, I mean, it's no coincidence, but the only thing I think holding in check the worst of the worst in terms of behavior and just sort of civilizational destruction is the abundance we have now. At the same time, and maybe conversely, it also feeds into this desire to sort of endlessly experiment with things, even if it's not entirely reasonable, given that there is a human nature that's observable. Um, but yeah, which makes me, well, more depressed. No, I'm always depressed, but it makes me even less inclined to think there can be any consensus because how can you talk to somebody on the left who doesn't think there's no human constants, and there's no first principles, they're difficult, obviously, for me since I'm not religious, but there's just no starting point at all. It's just anything goes, then they're operating purely off of whims and emotion. I've tried to converse and talk to some people on the left. I even try to grant points, um, but yeah, it just doesn't get through. I've yet to get through, and then to your earlier point, that everything's sort of defensive and everything is sort of based on sort of privation and negative on the right, and people on the right don't even agree about numerous things. Current factions, if you want to call it that, the identitarians, and then religious
Libertarian.
libertarians, religious traditions, objectivists, and I mean, you name it.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like you could have both like an objectivist and a traditional Catholic or a Catholic integralist kind of both dislike socialism, but they would
Sure.
obviously dislike it for very different reasons, or like somewhat similar reasons. But like, what what kind of action do you put against that? Like, how could both sides come together and kind of
Well, in that
uh,
case, I don't think they could. I mean,
yeah, they couldn't.
uh,
That's
objectivism seems inherently godless, right? So it's just not it's a
it is
non-starter.
very much anti-religious in nature.
Yes, actively so, maybe even. I mean, in fact, Ayn Rand, I read the books in my youth. I had a brief sort of infatuation with her stuff. Maybe it lasted about half a year. Um, yeah, I mean, she refers to your lot as the mystics of spirit, and to the lot parading through the streets and burning things down as the mystics of muscle, right? So yeah, she's very, yeah, anti-religious. I mean, yeah, so that doesn't really work. Um, and then you have to add some even more subtle layers amongst so-called identitarians, many of whom are not religious themselves, but nonetheless cling to the notion that religion is useful. One that I would cling to too, although I'm not an identitarian. Um, they might endorse some nominal religious structure, but they wouldn't fully subscribe to it because they just simply don't believe in it. Um,
Right, that's also like another kind of point that leads back to the idea of politics being the actual religion of the 20th and 21st century, where, like they are okay with religion, but they want religion to be embedded with the greater good, which is their political structure.
yeah,
So,
subordinate to it. Yeah.
so in that sense, classical religion is essentially like a tool for their true religion.
Yeah, I don't think that's anything new. I think I've mentioned this to you before, but m- back in the day in Rome, the gods, I always bring this up, but I believe it's Seneca the Younger, or I might be getting the author wrong, but sort of religion is viewed as true by the common man, by the wise man as false, and by the rulers as useful. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a new role for religion. Um, it's just that
Right.
it's distinct from, say, the opposition or people on the left, where they would just, at least formal religion, they wouldn't even acknowledge its use. They would just sort of, yeah, just cut it off at the head and just leave it at that. And so, yeah, I don't think that's necessarily um, different from over 2,000 years ago. That said, I think that it is distinct, obviously, from a sort of authority stemming from the church itself. I don't know if, say, identitarians would be cool with the idea of the Catholic Church having ultimate authority. They would like it to be subordinated to whatever wise politics they choose to practice, I'd imagine. Um, that would be a good, I think, Zerna, the Austrian, Martin Zerna, I don't know if the audience knows him. He's a Austrian, as an actual Austrian, I don't mean like from the school of Austrian, but Austrian identitarian. I suspect, I've never heard him explicitly, that he would be one such to sort of nominally support religious institutions and values because they might support his politics. Yeah.
I mean, he once described himself as as a Christian on a German podcast called Die
Yeah.
Zeitzone.
Well,
And
sure.
his wife is Catholic, as far as I'm aware. But
Yeah, she's
yeah,
probably
I don't.
legitimately religious, I suspect, but women are typically more religious than men on average. But yeah, yeah.
Right, and ultimately, yeah. I think Zella would have some serious disagreement with, especially like the current papacy. So he definitely wouldn't be in favor of, you know, being subordinate to the Catholic Church.
Yeah. But pragmatically, I just wonder, since we acknowledge the enormous difficulty of one being on the right, which I still find every time I say that, quote unquote, I'm on the right, it just feels very weird. It's very weird indeed. I've never thought of myself that way. Um, there's many differences within the quote unquote right wing, which I should have mentioned is that how much of this is just an issue of just human cognitive limitation? We just look at things in binaries. You know, we I mean, we have too many categories, people get confused. So everything becomes a binary. Um, I think we naturally tend towards that. So that's part of the issue. But um, and the other, and sad to say, but the left has won the cultural war. There's no doubt about that. Um,
Yeah, that's actually something I'm wondering about. And I think I just kind of grasped something during this very conversation. So the left keeps winning, right? Like pretty much with
Yes.
every cultural battles fighting, eventually you'll see the victory of the left.
Yes.
Um, Now there are some thinkers who've kind of likened the victories of right wing thinkers, obviously, have kind of compared the continuous victory of the left to something like entropy.
Mm.
And now it's been now, obviously, as much as I would kind of agree with this sort of description, it seems to be a bit of a point of kind of description that would almost be just kind of accepted by the right to kind of have like an explanation for the left's continuous victory, without like a really
Yeah.
like a way to derive the idea. But thinking about, like, we just discussed how um, on the right you seem to have like this view that human nature is a certain way, right?
Yes.
That you have something like human nature, and that's kind of where politics are derived from. While on the left, you really don't seem to have this vision of human nature, right?
No.
You have the blank slate, and in a sense, we also kind of talked about how this might come with just modern social developments of all kinds, of how many of the structures that used to give us like a shared kind of view of the world have collapsed. Oh,
Yeah.
essentially you have been weakened. So in a sense, yeah, the left and the left's view of humanity kind of seems to feed off this collapse. So in a sense, it is sort of it is a sort of entropy.
Yeah, but this also seems to me a bit sort of grasping at straws in the sense that, okay, call it entropy. That it's almost as if there's a tacit and implicit claim there that yes, they're winning, but it's not leading anywhere. Well, yeah, well, it leads to more entropy, so it leads to more disintegration, and then uh, there's a sort of embedded in that, even more deeply, arguably, is this idea that, well, yes, precisely, because eventually the entropy will grow so massive, or just encompass everything, that that's when the right can step in, because at some point in time it'll become intolerable to humanity itself, right? But
Right.
that's gonna be that would take a even if it were true, that would take such a long time. Uh, it's yeah, so I think I don't like this term cope, but that phrasing things as sort of it's just entropy, so don't eventually
Yeah,
it seems like a cope.
I don't really like this aspect of calling it entropy. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, because it kind of almost seems a bit too, in the way you described it right now, it almost seems to be a bit too optimistic. Honestly, I
yeah,
think we'll just keep losing for a while, but for now.
and eventually, yeah, the right will whatever the right is, we can't even figure that out exactly. We'll step in and fix things. I mean, we've talked about this privately, but I ultimately think that for people on the right, and I'm not including myself here because again, but for people who have very clearly right, align themselves with it, not people who are just coincidentally in the current year right wing, so to speak, that the foundational to survive the current state of affairs is the creation of sort of small communities. In your case, small communities, maybe small Catholic communities, other people might do whatever on their own, that obviously can exist entirely independently um, of these other things, but at the same time, the modernity or post modernity, as I call it sometimes, but nonetheless have some fighting chance of maintaining certain aspects of the traditions and what have you that lead to more sane outcomes than the ones we can observe right now.
Yeah, that would probably be the way. Um, And I guess it would definitely have to be on a very communal basis, and it would have to be like specific sort of groups, and not just like the right as the right, because as we kind of discussed, it would be hard to do.
Yeah, that's exactly why. I mean, there's no. Yeah, I mean, an objectivist community versus a Catholic one. I couldn't think of one that would be so well, different as possible. It possibly could be. Um, and I think that really is would have to
Honestly, I'm
be.
not even sure if like a objectivist community would be possible.
Yeah,
Like, seems almost to be like a contradiction in terms,
yeah, exactly. It probably would be.
despite of what Rand writes in Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, it probably would be. Uh, that said, I think that what other option is there? If we acknowledge that the left has won, and I think it has, and will continue to win, and I don't see any end in sight until things reach a level or a degree of complete non-functionality that that can't be recovered from at least in any reasonable amount of time. Then the only thing left is looking for or creating communities and try to going one's own way within those. No reference to MGTOW there, but just sort of yeah, going down a path that allows you to create a more wholesome environment for the people in there and the families or what have you. But even then, I'm the pessimist in me, and that's pretty much all there is in me. Thinks that those communities might not be able to survive the onslaught of modernity, and so you might have them for a while, but it will be encroached upon, it will creep in, and that people, especially the young people, will get exposed to certain ideas. Young people will be naturally rebellious.
At
Um,
least so. Again, like this community should not be defensive, right? It seems to me that any community that kind of puts all its cards on, we're going to defend ourselves from the forces of modernity, will ultimately succumb to the forces of modernity because let's be honest, just constantly being on the defensive lines is grinding, and I think that's also how the left kind of wins multiple cultural battles.
yeah, but
Um,
Franzo, how do you not how do you this is the issue. If the right is so varied and so differentiated, how on earth do you I mean, well, look, I guess historically, there's the idea of what the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I mean, so I hate to use these sort of enemy terms, but yeah, I mean, you could organize things along the lines of just we don't um, we just don't like things go on the left, so let's just sort of work to oppose it or what have you.
I mean, I don't think that even though I have doubts that it will ever be successful. There doesn't seem to be an alternative to pushing back.
Oh yeah, yeah, but it has to. I mean, the pushback that on the right that exists now is very lame, as in very weak.
It is.
Um, I don't
Again,
even in the
I too am
States. Yeah,
not a pessimist, but a bit of a cynic in regards to this.
yeah. I mean it's again I mentioned this before. The pushback is on GDP's up 6.5%. It's all good. Don't worry about it. That's the pushback. Those sort of conservative talking points. Crucial fundamental points of say human nature, lack of equality. Because on the right you'll hear, well, you mean equality before the law? I don't even think that exists. I think it's just sort of it, it's just a terrible phrase and terminology, but even the right has adopted it. So
That's a problem. Due to the right kind of being this out, essentially like being this out group to the left, you do have lots of formally left wing ideas in the right. So something like equality before the law is like a term.
yeah,
It is something that shouldn't be a part of the right, or at least not in its form, and at least not under this name. But now it is part of the right, so we kind of have adopted we kind of started using the left's rhetoric, and I think that's one of the bigger issues, right?
Sure, but how do you get rid of it? Because the idea behind it is you want to engage them on their terms, but if you just flat out say at the beginning, well, no, there's no such thing as equality, you're already setting yourself up for failure. They'll just say,
I'm not sure
okay.
if we want to engage them on their terms.
Well, no, I mean, I think things are so far gone that's a silly idea. I mean that this is the problem with the people who are, I guess, more left of center, like the Weinstein brothers I mentioned earlier, where they think they can still be reasonable to some degree. It's, well, maybe some kind of controlled immigration policy might be useful. They have no idea how far gone it's gonna, they just, and so thinking that you're engaging with reasonable people, it's I don't think most of these people are reasonable. They ignore statistical realities about the standard of living. Things are actually pretty decent. They make all sorts of assumptions. I mean, to this day, it's been almost well, it's been over a month, I think. We don't actually know if George Floyd was killed for racist reasons. It's not clear from the evidence, right? We don't even know that. But they make all sorts of assumptions. It's yeah, I agree, but there's no the right again. We don't even know what that is. Has no power and very little influence. And in any place that matters. I mean, sure, yeah, maybe there's some town in Idaho where things are at least Christian, maybe not Catholic, Christian and right wing, but it's not where the power struggles are taking place. They're taking place in places like San Francisco and New York and Washington and Los Angeles and what have you, right? Um,
Right.
so, yeah.
At the same time, when it comes to even though we kind of talked about how the right is essentially like a collection of non-left wing ideologies,
Hmm.
um, perhaps some coalitions are possible. Like even though they're like ultimately profound disagreements, in a sense, like I could see something like an identitarian Catholic coalition working. I could see some, where like at least there's some kind of basic common ground.
Yeah, yeah, probably. Some branches within the right would definitely be more uh, amenable to working together, others less so. But,
Problem is, what do we do with the others?
well, not just that. We have to fundamentally be aware of what is the reality of the right. Well, certainly in the Anglosphere, especially in the United States, it's just what the GOP, conservative, so-called conservative Republican. It's nothing. There's nothing. These people aren't talking about any of these ideas. In Germany, AfD. I mean, I don't even, aren't they just not as popular as they used to be? I haven't been following.
This is actually funny because it goes back to what we've been talking about, differences in ideology. And like in a sense, the AfD is almost like a microcosm, and Germany is almost like a microcosm of the right if you think about it, because
Mm.
it's just like this collection of very different types of right wingers, and you essentially now have like inner party conflicts that kind of drastically weaken it.
Ah, yeah, I think I heard about some of that. Yeah. Yeah, well, there you go. Um, and because of the sort of in-group, out-group dynamic that you discussed earlier, I mean, even though people like the Weinstein brothers are progressive and left-wing, they're basically on the right now, at least in the eyes of the mainstream left. So
Yes.
it's really easy, whereas the right sort of internally bicker. God, what was the name of the chairwoman? What was her name? It was a couple of years ago. She was heading the AFD. I think she disappeared or stepped down.
Frau
For
Petri.
Yeah, Frau Petre. Yeah, yeah. I think she's because of ideological distinction, differences or disputes. I'm
Right.
not sure. Yeah.
And I mean, that's basically like the perfect image. Like the outgroup of the left. They have ideas that the left doesn't want to cooperate with.
Mm,
So they're all already on the outside. So they certainly have to deal with this sort of enemy, and then they have now have like the internal conflicts, and those weaken them. So
yeah.
this kind of shows like the just like the two forces that are acting against any sort of like right wing success. And I don't think there will be anything like a truly successful right wing movement in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, but I do have a small kernel of hope, and that's the idea of a sort of competence that a lot of the people pushing the worst of left-wing ideology, I don't think they ultimately want to rock the boat of competency. So, basic government functions, infrastructure. When you push things too far, that would and will probably inevitably collapse. So I think there are sort of limits on how far they can go. Um, I suspect your average person who's competent is not going to be a devotee of far left ideology. It might just not even be very political to begin with. And being non-political automatically puts you in the right these days, basically. So I think there are some limits, unless they want to crash society to the ground and just destroy everything, and some of them I'm sure do. That's I guess a happy thought after all of this, maybe.
Yes, and you're right. It's funny that like non-political people really are part of the right now. I remember like some rant I think it was a couple of years ago, where some more left-leaning YouTubers started ranting about, people who are non-political are essentially just for the status quo, so they're right wing.
Yeah, I feel that way. I'm not very political, but I'm, yeah, I guess I'm on the right because I just don't agree with so much of what's going on with the current incarnation of the left. The denial of human nature probably being the biggest affront, but a lot of the, well, just emotional outbursts stemming from them. Uh, yeah, they just, so yeah, pretty much if you're not political, you're part of the right. Uh, and if you Yeah, I sometimes I just have to scratch my head because I can't imagine it being a political statement to say that sort of fundamentally mm, arson and destroying stores and shops that's just a bad thing. No good comes of it because I can't think of anything good that comes of it. Local economies are destroyed, uh, physical
Well,
destruction. Yeah, yeah.
um, according to them, and like I remember, sadly, I sometimes spend time on Twitter, which is a terrible idea, but you stumble upon like left-wing tweets, and I remember someone saying, "Well, it seems as though most protesters," and this is a terrible bullshit argument, but um, essentially he said, "Well, it seems as though most protesters intuitively understand the connection between racism and economic inequality and the current economic system we have in place. So this
Mm.
is what all the arson is actually about."
Ah, right.
So it's kind of this idea that they are destroying the power structure, which of course like is nonsensical, right? Like I don't even know how this sort of view comes about. That for some reason there's like wisdom of the masses.
Oh, oh yeah. Don't get me started on that. I Well, we have this issue, everyone's educated, supposedly. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of beyond the scope of the conversation, but I do think that, natural hierarchies exist, and for the record, I don't think education should be for all. But that's not the world we live in, and certainly not in the United States. So I think that yeah, that view, as incoherent as it might be to you or me, it seems to make sense to them, or at least it sort of justifies what's going or what was going on. I don't know if it stopped. And How do you reason with that? Well, the answer to that is you don't. So, yeah, if I were a religious white right-wing person, I would try to find like-minded people, pool resources together, and try to create a community, maybe a township or something in an area that's of competent people, that's far enough from large urban centers, or you could at least live out your days and continue living in a certain type of environment. Um, and hope, of course, the whole time that there are no intrusions upon that. But I'm not optimistic.
I mean, this seems to be, to a certain extent, this seems to be doomed to fail, right? Because we already discussed, like on the one hand, you would need to be the aggressor ultimately, and not like the one who's constantly defending himself, right?
Yep, true.
And on the other hand, for that to be successful, there needs to be like um, a fitting cultural ground for this, right? Like for certain ideas to be attractive, like the culture has to be a certain way.
Yeah,
And it seems to me that like the shared cultural understanding that could be the this cultural ground in earlier periods. This just doesn't exist right now.
no, I agree. It's gone. It's
So
been
yeah,
gone for a long
we're all
time.
doomed.
Well, I would finally agree about something. No, I agree. We're definitely all doomed. But I think that uh, the blow or the blows can be cushioned, and there are ways out for individuals, some more so than others. Um, I don't. I mean, if you're religious, this life is but a brief blip into eternity. So you know, it's not all that bad, I guess.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that's a good place to sort of end with the conclusion. Perhaps not the most optimistic one, but I've never been a fan of necessitating sort of truth with optimism. Some of the most unpleasant things in life can be true, but we are
Yeah,
forced to accept them.
this conclusion seems to be fittingly blackpilling for the channel.
Ah, well, I mean, but everything else would, I guess, would be dishonest. There's just no evidence that things are going to be turned around anytime soon. Um, and yeah, I think that said, I still think that the community idea is better than nothing for, especially for
Right.
religious
I
people.
agree.
So that's a good way of going about it.
I do not think we should go quietly in that good night. Just saying.
Yeah, yeah. And look, as far as I could tell, I haven't looked recently. I think there's been a lot of Christian conversion in the world as well, which is Catholic, I believe, even in China, no?
Yes.
So, sure. I mean, oh, that'll get crushed because of the government there. So it's, I mean, I guess it is doomed. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. Sorry if everything's doomed, but just because things are doomed doesn't mean you can't enjoy things in life. You can still enjoy things even though everything's doomed and you yourself are doomed. That's the way I look at it, at least. I'll actually have a lot more to say than that on a forthcoming video, out hopefully sometime during this month. I'll thank my guests, Hansa, aspiring
Oh, it's been a
physicist.
pleasure.
Yes, for me too, gleichfalls. Uh, Perhaps aspiring theologian and philosopher, and maybe we can do something similar in the future if the topic is suitable. And I hope you have a decent weekend and you take care. Bye bye.
Thanks.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.